Watch this. There it is. Sun's above your head and then it sets. One more time. That's exactly what is happening, okay? Let's change latitudes now and let's go to the North Pole. If you go to the North Pole, the North Star would be directly above your head at your zenith. So if this is the latitude of 45 degrees, because if the equator is here, this black line, that's 0 degrees. That's 45, which is right in the middle of 0 and 90 degrees. Okay? So the 45 degree parallel, the North Star is visible 45 degrees. The North Star would be here. Okay? So if you're at 90 degree north, the North Star is 90 degrees above your head. 40 degree, then it's 45 degrees above your head. Now if you're at the equator, the North Star would be directly 90 degrees. You wouldn't even be able to see the North Star if you go past the equator. See? Watch, I'm going to show you. But first, you're going to see how it looks. See, now it arches. It's going this way because the sun is at the equator, but you're not at the equator. So the sun doesn't go directly above your head. It does this arc. It's a curve instead of a straight line. So the sun would never do a straight line at the North Pole. It would always go around you, and the sun would never do a straight line going above your head. The sun would always be turning at the horizon at the North Pole. So the sun never sets in Sweden and Scandinavia during the summer. It keeps going around the horizon, and it's never above the head or below the horizon. It's at the horizon. Sometimes it's twilight, where the sun is below the horizon, but even though it's below the horizon, you still get light because it's not a ball. Well, peep this out, guys. This is very interesting here. Look what happens when we go past the equator and we go to the South Pole. Boom. The South Pole is near the horizon. It's never above your zenith unless you go to the South Wall, which we're not allowed to go there. So no one ever takes pictures of the South Pole directly above your head except for the Army. And that South Pole going the opposite direction is just a reflection. This dome is reflective, and as that turns this way, like that, this goes the other direction.
That I was called in and asked to solve this problem, this timeline contraction problem. And I eventually did my due diligence and did all the investigating and basically only had one piece of information, and that was reinforcement. The computer's right. The timelines will contract down to some inevitable thing. There is an inevitable event. It's been forecast, it's been predicted, it's been fed to us in a slop trough of what they want us to believe will happen. They don't actually have control over what happens. They only have control over the reaction, and it seems that no matter what they try to do to cause their desired reaction, it's going to have an opposite effect. Much, much easier for me to explain today what that process is as opposed to back then. If I had to give it a name, I would say it's the awakening process. It's an evolution of consciousness that cannot, will not, and no matter what decisions or possibilities are injected into the equation, eventually it all resolves down to us all learning the truth and becoming aware of this massive dam of lies that has been built that keep us from knowing massive volume of information that we should otherwise possess. Essentially what happened with Looking Glass, not only did they not want people to use it anymore because they knew it was just going to burp out the same thing, but at the same time they didn't want anybody else to know what it was saying. I'm sure. Because that information was of a monumental concern when I was in the military about how to prevent this inevitability. Now, at first I thought it was end of the world. Now I see end of the world as end of their world. The biggest cherry on top of all this conversation would be a synopsis to say that if I could convince everybody out there that For all intents and purposes, what we believe to be true eventually becomes true. If somebody convinces us that a major disaster is going to happen in the very near future, a major disaster happens in the very near future. If we don't buy into that fear and accept that there is really nothing that we know is going to believe to be true, eventually becomes true. If somebody convinces us that a major disaster is going to happen in the very near future, a major disaster happens in the very near future. If we don't buy into that fear and accept that there is really nothing that we know is going to happen, and accept of whatever happens, that makes the convergence of the timelines happen as naturally as possible. Any attempts to try to go away from this one inevitable conclusion, I again see as a new beginning, an end of this reality, the beginning of something that we can't even possibly understand based on the level of our beliefs currently. But when all that information comes flooding out, there's going to be no denying what's true and what's a lie or what's illusion. Basically, what we're experiencing right now is two master chess players sitting at the board. And one of them looks down at the board and sees that he's in checkmate in 7 moves. And he looks across at his opponent, and he knows that his opponent sees it too. So there's no getting out of it. So at this point, the loser can only prolong the game. Both players know the game is over. It's only a matter of time before he does this, and then you're forced to do this, and then he's forced to do this, and eventually checkmate. We, as a race, if we could understand that the game is over, that based on the rules of the game, the bad guys have already lost, the good guys have already won. Yes, there's moves left on the table, but those moves are being forced by the player that is going to win. The only way that checkmate can't happen is if the player that's winning makes a mistake. But from all of the information that I've gathered, all of the information that's been given, all of the information that's been vetted to me, it seems pretty obvious that the good guy player on the side of the chessboard knows exactly what has to be done to win the game. And so at this point, any mistake would be all but impossible.
There's a location in the Western Sahara Desert of Mauritania called the Richat structure. It's also commonly referred to as the Eye of the Sahara. What's so spectacular about this is that it just so happens to match what Plato had described as the lost ancient city of Atlantis. Plato described Atlantis as made up of concentric circles, 3 of water, 2 of land, which matches the Richat structure. It is also said to have an opening to the sea at the south. If you look at it from satellite imagery, you can clearly see that water had run through it. And what people don't realize is that Sahara Africa, up until about 4,500 to 5,000 years ago, was totally green. It was tropical. It had one of the largest networks of rivers ever known to exist. It was said to have mountains to the north, and you just so happen to have mountains called the Atlas mountain chain. There's so much that points to that, possibly, being Atlantis.
There's a whole realm of what I would call machining marks that exist all over these sites in Egypt. There's a place called Abu Sir that's been closed to the public for more than 100 years. You have to get special permission to go there. It's one of my favourite sites. It's an old kingdom site, like 5th dynasty. And all over this site, you find amazing evidence for massive circular saws. You see machining marks. There are these tube drills. I've got like an hour-long documentary just on the tube drills because there's been an argument going on for 150 years about the tube drills. There is evidence for very sophisticated and powerful tools that is etched into these artifacts from the very earliest points in Egypt all over the place. And a lot of these things, they disappear in later periods of time. I didn't send you any of the machining marks, but I can show them to you at some point. So you find the tube drills are really interesting because it's a very thin tool, and what they would do, they range in size from like a 1/2 inch up to 9 inches.
And are those plugs that were removed from the stone?
So it's like a hollow tool that gets cut down, and then you snap off the core.
The video reveals what appears to be a human-like figure moving through the water.
Yo, those videos were very, very crazy up to this far. But it's very hard to believe what you see these days, especially after growing up and realizing that maybe some of the things that you are taught or told do not add up.